The morning sun cast a gentle warmth across the peaceful suburban street as a young software engineer stepped out onto his front porch. He couldn't help but smile, taking in the sight of his new home. A beautiful two-story house with cream-colored walls and dark blue shutters. After 5 years of overtime shifts, careful saving, and countless sacrifices, he had finally achieved what felt impossible just a few years ago. The previous owners had left the garden in a sorry state, with overgrown weeds and patchy grass that hardly matched the neighborhood's well-maintained lawns. But he saw this as an opportunity rather than a problem. He'd spent the last week researching local plants and watching gardening videos, determined to transform his front yard into something special. That morning, he'd visited the local garden center, loading his car with colorful flowers, rich soil, and gardening tools. The store owner had been incredibly helpful, suggesting plants that would thrive in the local climate and offering tips about proper spacing and care. Now, with his new gardening gloves and a determined spirit, he was ready to bring his vision to life. The sun climbed higher as he worked, carefully removing weeds and preparing the soil. Each pull and dig brought a satisfying feeling of progress. He'd chosen a mix of purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and native grasses that would create a natural, flowing look. The sweat on his brow and the dirt on his knees felt like badges of honor, proof that he was making this house truly his own. Neighbors passed by on their morning walks, and he exchanged friendly waves with some of them. A few even stopped to compliment his choice of flowers, sharing their own gardening experiences and welcoming him to the neighborhood. An elderly couple walking their golden retriever mentioned how happy they were to see someone taking care of the property again. As lunchtime approached, he sat back on his heels to admire his progress. Already, the flower beds were taking shape, with neat rows of young plants promising future blooms. He'd also cleared space for a small vegetable garden along the side of the house, dreaming of fresh tomatoes and herbs later in the season. The pride he felt in this simple act of planting flowers was unexpectedly powerful. Each plant represented not just beauty, but his journey to this moment. He took a short break on the porch steps, sipping cold water and scrolling through his phone to share pictures with his family. His mother would be thrilled to see him following in her footsteps. She had always said a garden was a way of putting down roots, both literally and figuratively. His sister teased him about finally becoming a proper adult with his own garden to tend. The neighborhood had that perfect mix of friendly and peaceful he'd hoped for when house hunting. Children rode their bikes in the distance, their laughter carrying on the breeze. The ice cream truck's familiar jingle echoed from a few streets over, bringing back childhood memories. Everything felt right, like he'd finally found his place in the world. Little did he know that this peaceful scene was about to change dramatically. But for now, in this perfect moment, he was simply a proud homeowner, watching butterflies explore his newly planted flowers, living his own version of the American dream. He stood up, brushed off his knees, and picked up his trowel again. There were still more flowers to plant, and the afternoon stretched ahead with endless possibility. The peaceful afternoon shifted suddenly when quick, angry footsteps approached from down the street. The new homeowner looked up from his garden to see a woman in designer athleisure wear marching toward his property, her face set in a stern expression that seemed out of place on such a beautiful day. She clutched her phone in one hand and her small designer purse in the other, walking with the confidence of someone who believed they owned not just their house, but the whole street. He stood up slowly, brushing soil from his gardening gloves, and offered a friendly smile. Maybe she was going to welcome him to the neighborhood, like the others had done earlier. But that hope faded quickly when she stopped at the edge of his lawn, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the peaceful afternoon air. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" She didn't wait for his response before continuing. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I've never seen you before. This is a private community." The homeowner's heart sank, but he kept his composure. "Good afternoon," he replied calmly, gesturing to the house behind him. "I just moved in last week. I'm the new owner." He tried to keep his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he removed his gardening gloves. The woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Oh, really? Well, I find that hard to believe. These homes are very expensive." She emphasized the word very, as if it alone proved her point. "I'm going to need to see some identification and proof that you actually live here." A couple walking their dog on the other side of the street slowed down, watching the scene unfold. The homeowner felt his face grow warm, not from the afternoon sun, but from the humiliation of being questioned in front of his new neighbors. Still, he remembered his father's words about dignity being something no one could take away unless you let them. "Ma'am," he said politely but firmly, "I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood, but I don't actually have to prove anything to you. This is my home, which I worked very hard to buy. I'm just trying to make the garden look nice." The woman pulled out her phone and started recording. "Well, if you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't have a problem showing me some ID. I'm part of the neighborhood watch, and we take security very seriously here." She wasn't wearing any neighborhood watch badge or identification herself. More neighbors began to gather at a distance, drawn by the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, while a few pulled out their phones, either to record or perhaps to call someone. The homeowner noticed a young couple whispering to each other, the woman shaking her head in what looked like disapproval, though whether at him or the situation, he couldn't tell. "I'm going to call the police," the woman announced loudly, already dialing. "They can sort this out. And don't think about going anywhere." She started pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, speaking dramatically into her phone about a suspicious person and potential break-in. The homeowner took a deep breath, fighting back the anger and hurt that threatened to overwhelm him. He looked at his half-finished garden, the flowers he'd so carefully chosen still waiting to be planted. This was supposed to be a day of new beginnings, of creating beauty in his little piece of the American dream. Instead, he was being treated like a criminal on his own property. But as he stood there, watching this woman make her call, he made a decision. He wouldn't let her actions drive him from his own front yard. Instead, he calmly walked to his porch, sat down on the steps, and pulled out his wallet containing his ID and house papers. He'd deal with this situation with the same patience and determination that had helped him buy this house in the first place. Sometimes, he realized, the best response to hatred was simply refusing to let it change who you are. The woman's voice grew louder as she paced back and forth on the sidewalk, her phone held out in front of her like a shield. "Yes, officer, I'm still watching him. He's just sitting there, pretending to be calm, but who knows what he might do." She emphasized each word as if performing for an invisible audience, occasionally glancing at her phone to make sure she was still recording everything. The homeowner remained seated on his porch steps, his gardening tools scattered around the half-finished flower bed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his sister calling to check how the gardening was going. But he didn't want to reach for it, worried any sudden movement might escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on staying calm, watching a butterfly land on one of his newly planted flowers. The irony wasn't lost on him. Nature carrying on peacefully while human drama unfolded around it. More neighbors had gathered now, creating small clusters along the street. He could hear fragments of their whispered conversations carried on the breeze. "Isn't that the new owner? Someone should do something. This isn't right." A few cars slowed down as they passed, drivers craning their necks to see what was happening in their usually quiet neighborhood. The woman had moved on from her police call, but was now live streaming on her phone, narrating her version of events to her social media followers. "I'm protecting our community," she declared, walking back and forth. "You never know these days. Better safe than sorry." Her voice had taken on an almost cheerful tone, as if she was enjoying the attention. An elderly man from next door finally stepped forward from the growing crowd. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice shaking slightly but determined. "I was here when he moved in last week. There's no problem here except the one you're creating. The woman spun around, her face flushed with anger at being challenged. But the elderly neighbor stood his ground. The homeowner felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for the support, embarrassment at being the center of this spectacle, and a deep sadness that this was happening at all. He thought about all the extra hours he'd worked to afford this house, the careful budgeting, the dreams he had about being part of a community. Now here he was, being treated like an intruder in his own yard. A young couple who had been watching from across the street started walking toward his house, carrying their toddler. The woman with the phone quickly turned her camera toward them, but they ignored her completely. Instead, they walked right up to the porch, positioned themselves between him and his accuser, and started asking him about his garden plans as if nothing unusual was happening. "Those purple coneflowers are beautiful," the young mother said loudly, bouncing her curious toddler on her hip. "We tried growing them last year, but didn't have much luck. Any tips?" Her partner nodded encouragingly, deliberately turning his back on the woman with the phone. The homeowner felt his throat tighten with emotion at this simple act of kindness. He started explaining about the proper soil depth for the flowers, his voice growing steadier with each word. More neighbors began drifting closer, some joining the gardening conversation, others simply standing nearby in quiet support. The woman with the phone noticed her audience shrinking. Her live stream was no longer commanding attention as neighbors chose instead to chat about plants and welcome their new community member. Her voice rose in frustration. "The police are on their way. Don't any of you care about neighborhood safety?" But even as she spoke, the atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a tense confrontation was transforming into an impromptu neighborhood gathering. Someone mentioned bringing over coffee. Another neighbor offered spare gardening tools. The elderly man who had spoken up earlier shuffled over with a handful of seeds from his own garden. In the distance, police sirens grew closer. The homeowner took a deep breath, his documents ready in his pocket. He wasn't worried anymore. Not with half the neighborhood now standing in or near his garden, chatting about flowers and plant care. Sometimes, he realized, the worst situations bring out the best in people. Whatever happened next, he knew he had already found his community. 2 police cars pulled up quietly, their lights off, and parked at the curb. The officers stepped out, taking in the unusual scene before them. A front yard full of half-planted flowers, a crowd of neighbors chatting about gardening, and one agitated woman still holding her phone up, recording everything. The first officer, a veteran with gray streaks in his hair, approached with careful steps. His younger partner stayed a few paces behind, notebook ready. They'd been told to expect a threatening situation, but what they found looked more like a neighborhood garden party gone slightly wrong. "We received a call about a suspicious person," the older officer said, his tone professional but not accusatory. The woman with the phone rushed forward, but he held up his hand, silently asking her to wait. Instead, he turned to the homeowner, who was still sitting calmly on his porch steps. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" The homeowner stood up slowly, his house papers and ID already in hand. "Of course, officer. I've been expecting you." He spoke clearly and calmly, though his heart was racing. The young couple who had been chatting with him about gardening stepped aside, but stayed nearby, a quiet show of support. The woman with the phone tried to interrupt. "Officer, I've been recording everything." He just showed up and... "Ma'am," the younger officer said firmly, "please give us a moment to sort this out." He guided her a few steps back, while his partner reviewed the homeowner's documents. The older officer looked through the papers carefully. The deed, recent utility bills, ID. Everything matching perfectly. He glanced at the house number, then back at the paperwork, then at the small collection of garden tools and newly purchased plants scattered across the yard. "Looks like you're getting some gardening done today," he commented, handing the documents back with a slight smile. The homeowner nodded, explaining his plans for the flower beds and vegetable garden. As they talked, more neighbors drifted closer, adding their own voices to the conversation. "He just moved in last week," the elderly neighbor called out. "Been working on the yard every day since. First time this place has looked decent in years." The woman with the phone had gone quiet, but her camera was still rolling. The younger officer turned to her. "Ma'am, would you like to explain why you felt it necessary to call us?" She lowered her phone slightly, her confidence wavering as she looked around at the faces of her neighbors. Many were giving her disapproving looks, while others simply turned their backs, continuing their conversations about plants and gardening tips. I was just trying to protect our neighborhood," she stammered, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. The officers exchanged knowing looks. The older officer addressed the crowd. "Well, folks, seems to me your new neighbor here is doing a fine job improving the property. Unless anyone has actual evidence of wrongdoing." He paused, met with silence except for the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze. "Sir," he turned back to the homeowner, "you're free to continue with your gardening. Sorry for the interruption." Then to the woman, "Ma'am, we'd like to have a word with you about proper use of emergency services." As the officers led the woman aside for a conversation about false reporting and wasting police resources, the atmosphere in the garden shifted again. Someone brought out a pitcher of lemonade and plastic cups. The elderly neighbor returned with his promised seeds and detailed planting instructions. The young couple's toddler had found a plastic watering can and was happily helping water the new flowers, getting more water on herself than the plants. The homeowner looked around at his yard, now full of neighbors sharing drinks and gardening advice. What had started as an attempt to intimidate him had transformed into exactly what he'd hoped for when he bought the house: a sense of community. As he picked up his trowel to get back to planting, 3 different people offered to help. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the scene, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he felt truly at home. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By sunset, what had started as an ugly confrontation had transformed into something unexpected. People kept appearing at the front yard, carrying dishes, drinks, and garden supplies. The once empty garden was now bustling with activity, as if the whole neighborhood had decided to hold an impromptu welcome party. A middle-aged couple arrived with a tray of homemade cookies and apologetic smiles. "We saw everything on our neighborhood group chat," the wife explained, setting down the treats. "We wanted you to know that's not who we are as a community." Her husband nodded, adding, "We brought some extra garden tools too, if you could use them." The young couple who had stood by him earlier had stayed, their toddler now napping in a portable chair they'd brought from home. They shared stories about their own move to the neighborhood 2 years ago, offering tips about the best local shops and restaurants. "The hardware store down on Oak Street gives a 10% discount if you mention you're a local," the husband explained. "And they carry all the gardening supplies you might need." An older woman who lived at the corner house brought over a folder filled with community information, schedules for trash pickup, dates for neighborhood events, and contact numbers for local services. "I keep these for new neighbors," she said with a warm smile. "Though usually, I get to deliver them under better circumstances." The elderly neighbor who had first spoken up in his defense had returned with not just seeds, but detailed handwritten instructions for planting them. "These will bloom beautifully next spring," he explained, pointing to his own garden across the street as proof. "Been growing them for 20 years now." As the evening progressed, more neighbors arrived, each bringing something different. A teacher from down the block brought extra plants from her own garden. A family with teenage kids offered to help with the planting. Even the local mail carrier stopped by at the end of their route to express support and share their own story of facing prejudice when they first started delivering in the area. The conversation flowed naturally from gardening to home maintenance, to local history, to shared experiences. People exchanged phone numbers, offered recommendations for local services, and made plans for future gardening projects. The homeowner found himself drawing a rough sketch of his garden plans on a napkin, with several neighbors eagerly contributing suggestions. "You know," said a woman who'd brought over a homemade casserole, "we should make this a regular thing. Not just today, but maybe monthly garden gatherings. Take turns helping each other with our yards." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic nods and quick agreements. The young mother whose toddler had earlier helped with watering pulled out her phone and started a group chat. For gardening tips and neighborhood updates, she explained, adding people as they volunteered their numbers. And so you know you've always got neighbors watching out for you, in a good way this time. As the sky turned purple with sunset, someone strung up solar-powered garden lights they'd run home to get. The soft lighting gave the gathering a festive feel, transforming the half-finished garden into an enchanted space. Children chased fireflies while their parents chatted, shared food, and continued offering help with the remaining planting. Looking around at the scene, dozens of neighbors sharing food and conversation in his garden, people exchanging contact information and making plans for future get-togethers. The homeowner felt a profound sense of belonging. What had started as one person's attempt to make him feel unwelcome had instead revealed the true heart of his new community. Sometimes, the elderly neighbor said quietly, watching the scene with satisfaction, "It takes something bad to bring out the best in people. Welcome home, neighbor. You're exactly where you belong." A week after the incident, the homeowner sat in his living room, staring at his phone. His inbox was flooded with messages from local news stations wanting to cover the story. Someone's video of the confrontation had gone viral, and now everyone wanted to hear his side. He could have easily used this attention to shame the woman who had harassed him, but something didn't feel right about that approach. Instead, he opened his laptop and typed out a thoughtful email to the neighborhood association. Rather than filing a complaint, he proposed something different. A community gathering to talk openly about making their neighborhood more welcoming for everyone. To his surprise, the response was almost immediate and overwhelmingly positive. The following weekend, his newly flourishing garden hosted a different kind of gathering. The neighborhood association had helped set up chairs in a circle on his lawn, and nearly 50 people showed up. Some brought snacks and drinks, others brought their children, but most importantly, they brought open minds and willing hearts. "I could have responded with anger," he began, standing in front of his blooming flower beds. "Nobody would have blamed me. But anger just creates more anger. Instead, I'd want to share something with you all." He pulled out his phone and showed them pictures of his journey to homeownership. Long nights at the office, savings account statements, and finally, the proud moment of getting his keys. "This isn't just my story," he continued. "It's the story of anyone who's worked hard to achieve their dreams, only to have others question whether they belong." His words resonated with many in the audience, and hands started raising as others wanted to share their own experiences. A young professional spoke about being the only woman in her office. An elderly man shared memories of facing discrimination decades ago when he first moved to America. A teenager talked about feeling judged at school because of his accent. Each story built upon the last, creating bridges of understanding between neighbors who had lived near each other for years but never really knew one another's struggles. The conversation wasn't always comfortable. Some people admitted to their own biases, while others expressed guilt about times they'd witnessed discrimination but stayed silent. But the discomfort led to growth, as people asked questions they'd always been afraid to ask and shared thoughts they'd always been afraid to voice. One neighbor, a local teacher, suggested creating a welcome committee for new residents. Another proposed regular community dinners where people could share their cultural traditions. A retired social worker offered to lead workshops on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. The children present played together on the lawn, oblivious to the heavy topics being discussed, showing everyone how natural inclusion could be when not clouded by learned prejudices. They traded snacks, shared toys, and worked together to water the garden's flowers, not caring about their differences. As the afternoon progressed, The conversation shifted from problems to solutions. People broke into smaller groups, brainstorming ideas on notepads. The neighborhood association president took notes on his tablet, nodding as suggestions flowed. Monthly cultural exchange events, a community newsletter highlighting diverse resident stories, youth mentorship programs. The woman who had caused the initial incident wasn't there. She'd been lying low since the police visit. But several people who knew her well mentioned that she'd been doing some serious reflection. They shared that she'd enrolled in a cultural sensitivity course at the local community center and had written a lengthy apology letter that she was too ashamed to deliver in person. As the sun began to set, people lingered, continuing conversations in small groups. The homeowner looked around at his garden, now not just full of flowers but of hope. What could have been a story of division had become a catalyst for change. His fence was lined with scheduled dates for future community events, sign-up sheets for various initiatives, and promises of continued dialogue. "You know," said an older resident, helping to fold up chairs, "sometimes the best gardens grow from the most difficult soil. You've planted something special here, and it's not just the flowers." 3 months had passed since that dramatic summer day, and the neighborhood had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The homeowner's garden had become more than just a beautiful display of flowers. It had grown into a symbol of community transformation. Every Saturday morning, neighbors gathered for what they now called garden and grow sessions. Today, the front yard was bustling with activity. The elderly neighbor was teaching a group of kids how to identify different plants, while their parents worked together, planting fall vegetables in the community garden they'd started in the empty lot down the street. The woman who had caused the initial confrontation had finally found the courage to come by a few weeks ago. She'd arrived early one morning, hands shaking as she held the handwritten letter and a small potted peace lily. Her apology wasn't just words. She'd spent the past months taking classes on cultural awareness and had started volunteering at a local community center. Now, her peace lily bloomed alongside the other flowers, a daily reminder that people can grow and change. The neighborhood newsletter, started after the incident, had become a celebrated monthly publication. This month's issue featured stories from different residents about their journeys to homeownership, their cultural traditions, and their dreams for the community. The young couple's toddler, who had helped water the garden during the confrontation, had her artwork featured on the cover, a colorful crayon drawing of people holding hands around a garden. The Welcome Committee, born from that first community meeting, had developed into something special. New residents now received more than just a folder of information. They got a proper welcome celebration, complete with a plant for their garden and introductions to their neighbors. The police officers who had handled the situation so professionally had even joined one of these welcomes, sharing tips about community safety and building trust. Today was extra special. They were celebrating the completion of the neighborhood's first Unity Garden, a project that had grown from those early discussions. Every family had contributed something: plants, labor, stories, or skills. The garden featured plants from different cultures, each with a small plaque telling its story. Children played hide and seek between the raised beds while their parents shared recipes using the herbs they grew together. The young mother who had first stood up for the homeowner had started a popular social media account documenting their community's transformation. Her posts about their gardening projects and community initiatives had inspired similar programs in other neighborhoods. Local news stations, which had initially wanted to cover the confrontation, now came by to report on their success story instead. The homeowner's original flower beds had expanded, with neighbors contributing plants that held special meaning to their families. There was a rose bush from a grandmother's garden, herbs from an immigrant family's homeland, and flowers that represented different cultural celebrations. Each plant had a story, and together they created a living history of their community. Even the local real estate agents had noticed a change. Property values in the neighborhood had increased, not just because of the beautiful gardens, but because it had become known as a place where diversity was celebrated and neighbors looked out for each other. The neighborhood association now received regular calls from other communities asking for advice on building similar programs. As the homeowner watched a group of kids running through the garden, laughing and pointing out their favorite plants, he couldn't help but smile. His fence, once the backdrop for an ugly confrontation, now displayed a hand-painted mural created by local artists, showing hands of different colors joining together to plant a garden. The elderly neighbor walked up, offering a cup of coffee. "You know," he said, looking around at their thriving community, "sometimes the worst storms bring the best harvests. Look at what grew from that terrible day." He gestured to the yard full of people sharing stories, food, and friendship. A delivery truck pulled up, bringing supplies for next week's community dinner. As people rushed to help unload, their easy teamwork and warm greetings showed how far they'd come. The neighborhood had transformed from a place where someone was made to feel unwelcome into a community where everyone belonged. And it all started with one man who chose to respond to hatred by planting seeds of change, both literally and figuratively.